How you doing, everybody? It's Monday. I'm going to start potentially a new series here, kind of depending on how the response I get to this. If people are interested in this and think it's fascinating, I'll probably do more. So I guess we'll see if it's a series or not. But this is 1967, and I want to put a little footnote here right away saying some of these records might have come out in late 66, some might come out early in 68, but for the most part, I think everything is from 67-ish. I'm hoping it is. So correct me if I'm wrong if you want, but the point would still remain. It's the times, the era, and the vibe that we're talking about. We're going to take a look at rock, soul, and jazz and see what's happening in all the different musics of that time, and how there was a lot of cross-germination happening. The psychedelic era was in full swing. Drugs and the counterculture was in full effect. Jazz was being influenced by rock and by soul, and it was only going to be more so going forward. The social conscious movement of that time had crept into rock and roll. It was starting to be spoken through the microphones of the soul singers. And at the same time, jazz was kind of losing its voice. That coded message that came across through horns, through emoting and improvising, that vehicle was now being dampened by the open expression into a microphone of this new generation of music. We're going to jump around here. I'm going to play some soul records, some rock records, and some jazz records. We started out with Eric Burdon and the Animals, who was very influenced by R&B and black music in his early days. And then he ends up joining Spill the Wine, War, makes a couple records with those guys that are very much in the crossover genre of things. But in the late 60s, he makes some psychedelic stuff that I think is pretty interesting. Just for a little taste, this is 4 years after the Bossa Nova was big. We're talking 67, and the great Francis Albert Sinatra does this record with Antonio Carlos Jobim. For my money, it's the best Sinatra record. That's the one I play the most often. I come back to the most. I play it at my gigs a lot. It's a fantastic, beautiful, sincere take on these songs by a guy that often can be very poppy and egotistical and boisterous. There's almost a humility to Sinatra here, where he feels like he's playing something sacred and he's showing a great respect to it. And it's a nice side of Sinatra, and it's a record I can't really recommend enough to people. That being said, it's on the fringes of jazz in 67. CTI was on the horizon with Creed Taylor. Those who see my episode on Creed Taylor know about that. But Creed Taylor was still now at A&M before CTI launches, and this is where he's at. This is moody, atmospheric, lounging, pina colada music. And this was probably as commercial as jazz was in 1967. These records probably sold fairly well, at least compared to most of what else was happening in jazz in 67. Soul music was really starting to come into its own. We're all pretty familiar with this song. I don't want to play too much of some of these tracks because I don't want to have my video be edited by the powers that be. But this was a big song, and it's starting to really show the relevance of the groove that James Brown kind of instills. But I feel like there's some cross-germination in all the different genres of music at this point. The Beach Boys are doing stuff like Vegetables, and some of the other tracks on here. It just feels like it's kind of in line with what's happening in jazz and the avant-garde and the free expression and the new instrumentation. Here's a very crossover example of something kind of psychedelic, but still very much listenable for a large audience. Now we're going to take a look at what Bill Evans was doing. He's been in Verve now for almost 6 years probably. And if I recall, he's playing by himself here. And Evans, thankfully, is one of those guys that never strays too far from Bill Evans. He's always kind of within himself, playing what he does. And he always had some edges and some shades of dissonance to him anyway. So he didn't need to go far out off the charts and the map to reinvent himself to be in step with the times. He kind of always was a little bit ahead of the average curve. Another Beach Boy record I want to show you from the same time frame. Got some good stuff on it. Wild Honey. I'm a big Bill Evans guy. I like pretty much all his discography. His Riverside stuff is, of course, you know, landmark stuff, but it doesn't take away from his Verve stuff. And the nice thing about his Verve titles is you can get those for a killing compared to what you pay for the Riverside stuff. Buffalo Springfield. Here we got a little bit of rock and roll. That kind of rock's pretty straightforward. Got Neil Young singing there. Buffalo Springfield was a great group. Stephen Stills in his prime. Powerful group. They, of course, had the big hit the year before, For What It's Worth. That's one of the great songs of the 60s. And then another guy who I think we'd be remiss not to mention here is the great Leonard Cohen. Of course, he's a Canadian, just like I am. This record comes out in '67. There's a couple years gap between this and his next records. This is an incredible record of folk, sexually tinged, spiritually tinged music. And there's a certain amount of lyrical freedom and avant-gardism to what he's saying and what he's expressing that I think is fairly cutting edge in a lot of ways. Cohen spends most of his career on the edges. You know, he really does. Now we're going to dig into one of the great songs probably of all time. And it's just interesting seeing what's happening in these different genres. This is one of those records that as a DJ, 40 years later, you can still play this. And it's really timeless. It's got a great move to it. He also did this Raw Soul record in '67. And I'd have to guess probably a few other records in '67. The guy was prolific. He records and records and records and records. And again, I don't want to play too big a snippets of some of these soul and some of these rock records, so I don't want to have to go back and edit stuff, which is effing annoying. So what's jazz doing to respond to this? Well, if you watched my Blue record session a couple of weeks ago, you'll know that Blue Note is trying to get a little funkier, a little more rhythm and blues in their sound. Lee Morgan's Sidewinder was a huge breakthrough for Blue Note in terms of them being able to continue. This is Lee Morgan's Cornbread, and Morgan makes a number of records in this vein. These records usually aren't boogaloo all the way through. See, that's more traditional modern jazz there. Jackie McLean, Hank Mobley, Herbie Hancock, Larry Ridley, Billy Higgins. It's a great lineup. So there's definitely still some great cutting edge, straightforward jazz being made, even on the boogaloo records. And even a lot of the free avant-garde stuff, we usually have some stuff that's a little bit more straight ahead and approachable. A Woodstock group that's famous for the anti-war song that they did. This is them in '67. Country Joe and the Fish, Sweet Lorraine. Here's the track Flying High. Some real blues influence there. See, the face of music was changing in every aspect of it. It was just changing fast and rapidly. And '67 is probably the most magical year in music history. Cream, of course, is fantastic. McCoy Tyner, he's left Coltrane by this point. He and Elvin Jones had kind of had enough of the free and the avant-garde stuff and the unpredictability and the difficulty of playing with Coltrane. And it's funny because when him and Elvin leave, they both go back to playing fairly straight ahead stuff. There's not a lot of edge to McCoy after this, and Elvin finds himself usually making fairly straight ahead records with people as well. Of course, another record by these guys that came out in '67 that's pretty famous. I'm scared to play anything from this. I think the bops will be out there in full effect. But to even give you this, this is popular music, and there's sitars in it. And we see that influence and that willingness to go across the borders in music in all the different genres and facets here. Horace Silver didn't get caught up much in trends and what was happening. Horace Silver stuff always stays fairly in a straight ahead, grooving. He was a lot of the force behind the hard bop movement, but he was always on the softer, slightly slower side of the hard bop. And this is one of the guys that's the most important guys in music right here. He's got inflections of the gospel. He is soul music, rhythm and blues. He's capable of playing jazz. He reinvents country on those two modern Western country records. He's just omnipresent throughout the late 50s, into the 60s, and even in the 70s. And even in the 80s and 90s, he was a recognized legend in his lifetime. Thank God for that. He's really a brilliant singer, a brilliant player, wears his heart on his sleeve. And if you don't like Ray Charles or have some Ray Charles records, you need to go out and fix that immediately. Of course, Motown has been going pretty strong now in Detroit since like '62 or so, but they really didn't hit their stride until about '65. And that's a bird in it. This is, of course, the great Four Tops. Reach Out, I'll Be There. Beautiful melody, some great harmony, a great driving groove. '67 ends up being a great year for a lot of people in the music business because the psychedelic thing was happening, and the music industry almost lets go of the reins of the control of production, sound, how we're going to allow things to look and feel, and the freedom that was trying to happen in the streets and trying to happen in politics and the social movements. Music was electrified and really expressing a lot of that stuff. And by 69, 70, the reins have been pulled in. And the infinite possibilities of what you could do in 67, by 69, things have changed greatly, especially in rock. We're about to enter the era of Neil Young's Harvest Moon, or Heart of Gold, and the Eagles, and much more straightforward stuff. Here in 67, the Doors' first two records come out, and to me this is the Doors that everybody should have. It's fantastic. It's got edges of psychedelic, some great poetry. People read a lot into what Morrison was saying. I think a lot of it's just kind of less shaman and more gibberish. But remember, he's an art student, not an oppressed tribesman. His depth is going to be limited by some of that comfort, West Coast, middle class experience. And again, I don't want to have my thing. So here's Miles Davis now in 67. And this second grade quintet is in full effect at this point. And they're making records that have a lot of elements of what's happening around them. Edges of the avant, edges of swing and groove, edges of the composition. It really was a broad, all-encompassing sound that was happening across music. There's definitely some impact and influence even from Coltrane here. The band's playing big, full, driving, but there's edges to it. And Shorter was more than capable of that. Of course, on the same label across town, the great Mr. Dylan has just come off a dangerous motorcycle accident in 67 where he didn't really make a record. This comes out in early 68, and he's just important to always have a reference point where he's at, because he reinvents folk, he reinvents rock, he reinvents kind of the country thing. He's such an important figure, and there's a certain jazz sensibility to his vocal expressing. He will just kind of emote what he's feeling and thinking. And there's a lot of improvisation in Dylan's lyrics. And even when you hear him live, he'll change things up. He'll sing the cadence differently. He'll change the words up. He'll inflect it differently. There's times you almost don't recognize what Dylan song you're hearing live. Grateful Dead show up on the scene in 67, and of course they're a huge change in the West Coast sound, very psychedelic, but they also had a lot of blues and American roots music in what they did, and they never took the American roots music out of their sets. It was a huge part of what the Dead always did. But if you look at music in 65 and you see how streamlined rock is, and then you look at 67 and you take in the incredible variance in sound from the Dead to the Doors to Pink Floyd. Richie Havens is kind of a folk hippie protest giant. He made some great records in the 60s. Of course, he was a big part of Woodstock. You gotta kind of keep an eye on what he was up to. And now again, another new sound. Hendrix on the guitar. He comes along and reinvents it. You never heard electric guitar until you heard Jimi Hendrix. It's insane what's happening in '67 in so many different genres. This, of course, also came out in '67, as did Surrealistic Pillow by the Jefferson Airplane, another great psychedelic West Coast record. And so jazz has lost its footing in so many ways. It's being influenced by what's happening, and it's making jazz turn out a really wide field of jazz. This is Bobby Hutcherson, Happenings. I love this record. Hutcherson will always have a little bit of edges to him. Sometimes he gets further out with the avant-garde than other times. But he's staying fairly accessible here. This is the Don Ellis record, Electric Bath. And you're seeing how there's rock, R&B, jazz, that all has sounds that borrow from each other. And this has some elements of swing in it there. Interesting stuff. And there's some kind of avant-garde stuff there, where we're getting a little bit on the edges. Another great band, I think they're also from the West Coast. Was Love. And they made 3 records here in the late 60s that are fairly fantastic, psych rock, just records with some good feeling to them, some lovely expressions. Of course, famously sampled by Method Man. Marvin Gaye does these 2 records with Tammy Terrell here in '67, and it's before Marvin's really hit his train of thinking that he gets to on what's going on, but it's still a very great, fruitful period of Marvin Gaye's career. He makes records throughout the '60s at Motown that are fantastic, and his early stuff. Soul music's changing so rapidly at this point. You know, it's going through these rapid changes socially. Sam Cooke. Moody Blues, a great UK group. They make some great records in the 60s and in the 70s. The Knights of White Satin is pretty omnipresent. Most people are going to be familiar with that. But it's just really insightful to see all the changes that are happening in music. Here's Wayne Shorter in '67 with the Adam's Apple record. And there's a Boogaloo number that starts this, but Shorter was never going to be boxed in too much. And there's some great improvising on here with Hancock, Reggie Workman, and Joe Chambers. Hancock and Shorter have a great simpatico. They really kind of are into and feeling what the other one's saying and doing. One of the most important guys in soul music is Curtis Mayfield, and he goes solo in the 70s and makes some really important records in the 70s. But People Get Ready comes out in '67, as does this great record, One on One. And People Get Ready, he's talking about the social movements, the spiritual awakening, and the power of community. And you gotta feel what Mayfield and the Impressions are talking about. It's beautiful stuff, and those records are definitely worth tracking down. Of course, you got Van Morrison early here on the Bang label, and this song is fairly ubiquitous, so I'm gonna pull it down. So I don't want to have the bots find me. So all this crazy new sounding music is happening. And of course jazz is going to pick up on that. And this record by Don Cherry is jazz going beyond the scopes and hearing what rock and roll is doing. It's hearing the movements in R&B, and it's realizing that we're not going to be the poppy, accessible R&B music, and we might not have the straight psychedelic hippie power of the rock movement, but we certainly can push the envelope of the music. And I'm not a huge fan of the Don Cherry records. He's a great player, but he's definitely on the edges most of the time. And this is music to attack a hornet's nest with. You know, there's a hornet's nest, you got a broomstick, and you're gonna do your damnedest. You might get stung a few times. Another band that shows up on the landscape is Pink Floyd, of course, and this is a UK version on Tower, if you can see that. But the Pink Floyd that we know of from the 70s, Dark Side of the Moon, Wish You Were Here, The Wall, is a long ways from what Pink Floyd was doing in '67. The music everywhere was just free. It was changing. It was incorporating global sounds. And I think on some level jazz, having lost so much of its way and its footing, a certain element of jazz is trying to push the boundaries so far. And there's still accessible jazz being made. Very bluesy. Another great song. Most people are going to be fairly familiar with that. Don't want the bots to hear it. Gotta take it down. I really hope I can publish this without having to go through and edit a bunch of shit. Sam Rivers now, who played briefly with Miles in like early '60s. He's made 4 or 5 records on Blue Note by this point. And this stuff has a lot of edge to it. It's driving. It's got some swing to it. Sitting by the dock of the bay. One of the great songs of this era. The music of 67 is truly probably the most diverse era of human popular music ever recorded. There was so much interesting stuff happening, some of it great, some of it less than. And speaking of less than, the Beatles, of course, did their Sgt. Pepper and were hugely popular with it. The Stones answered with Satanic Majesty's Request, which when I was a psychedelic, acid-doing kid, I thought was pretty brilliant. But even then, I could tell it wasn't as accessible as Sgt. Pepper. But there's a few really fun songs on here. 2,000 Light Years from Home, 2000 Man, Citadel, The Lantern. But again, this is the Rolling Stones doing a hippie bash. You know, it's a whole different side of the Stones and popular music. This comes out posthumously, or it might have been the last one. No, you might have still been alive. I can't recall actually. Expression was the last, came out after he died for sure. But Coltrane is really comfortable pushing those boundaries. And by this time, the audience for jazz was the white record buyer. The guy who was buying the Stones and the Beatles was also buying Coltrane. You know, the crossover had become so, it encompassed everything now. You know, we were gonna like soul music. We're gonna like some psychedelic rock. We're gonna like blues-based rock. And we're gonna like the soul blues music. Pretty straightforward, great song. For my money, the soul music of the late 60s is some of the funnest music we've made on this planet. A few of the records I want to show you here. Stones Between the Buttons, I think actually is late 66, probably Christmas time. Strawberry Alarm Clock, Incense and Peppermints. Just the diversity. The Traffic, Mr. Fantasy, Young Stevie Winwood and Company. Great record, fantastic stuff. Gladys Knight has some records on Motown where she doesn't really make her best stuff. She makes her best stuff in the 70s. Smokey Robinson, You Must Be Love. The Love I Saw Was Just a Mirage. So there's a lot of great soul music happening. But it's a fantastic year in music. There's just changes afoot everywhere. This is Pharoah Saunders. That guy, when I was into Coltrane, I got into a lot. He makes a lot of what's called spiritual jazz. Some of it's really good. Some of it's meditational. Some of it's almost unlistenable to me anymore. Most of his records start off with a melancholy and move into a cacophony. And he's a fascinating guy. And there's a lot of debate, even still to this day, about the avant-garde and the new thing. And is this music accessible? Is it listenable? And the jury's out. You know, it's a lot of it comes down to what your tastes are. This is what's happening in pop music. This is what's happening in jazz. Never the twain shall meet, as they say. Another landmark record from '67 is, of course, the Velvet Underground. And I don't think the records are actually all that great. This is one of those records I've gone and re-listened to over the years, and I feel differently about a lot of their stuff now, but it doesn't change the fact there's not a few songs by these guys that are fantastic. Venus and Furs is one of my favorite songs ever. It's got that driving, edgy, melancholy, it's sensual. They run Verve, by the way, which is an interesting side note. The Who make this record in '67, and The Who were the third wheel of the Beatles Stones tricycle, and in some ways they were capable of rocking the most. But this is the '67, so they're making Silas Stingy. I haven't heard this in a long time. So you can see there's such a wide range of what was considered popular music. And with that bridge being so broad, what was considered out had to go even further out. Frank Zappa, he's a guy with the Mothers especially who I love. His stuff is so avant-garde. Plastic People, he's on the edge all the time.
There's this guy from the CIA and he's creeping around
Laurel Canyon. My psychedelic years, I loved some of these early Mothers records. But I feel like all this music is pushing jazz further and further out. Pop had gotten so crazy. R&B had gotten so popular. Where was left for jazz to make its mark? Along with James Brown, Sly Stone is one of the great changes in the course of music in the late 60s. Integrated both by race and by gender. They made records that were so fun, such a party, so accessible. And I've heard stories of Miles being at Monterey and watching Sly Stone and feeling so out of touch in '67. Feeling so like, I can't make the crowd do that. And there's nothing worse than being in a band, and I've been in bands for years, I was for years, when you have to play with other bands and they're killing the audience, and you're sitting there going, nobody's moving. Nobody feels it. And it's a lot more fun being the group that comes on that makes the whole place go nuts. I'll be in that band every time, thank you very much. But so we're back to the Pharoah Saunders, and you see we're gypsies in the forest all of a sudden. But that could have been on a Dead record. That could have been on a Zappa record. Stevie Wonder's really starting to come into his own as a songwriter in '67. All in all, it's an exciting time in music. It's an exciting time on the planet. There's a lot of changes happening. We're entering a new era. There's this movement of the people and the worker, and the conflict globally between socialism and capitalism was in full swing. The propaganda was everywhere, but there was a sense of a betrayal, and there was cracks showing up in the politic, and the Great Suppression was about to happen. The war on drugs was about to kick in to not only subvert the militants and the people who wanted to change capitalism. It also gave them a great excuse to abuse minorities and throw their rights and privileges away. So the 60s are this incredible fulcrum. All this stuff is coming into focus, and the denial of what was promised after the war, and the 60s has this recession and the violence in the streets. It's all kind of coming to a head, and there's an optimism in what the hippies are doing, and it had to be squelched. And jazz is this kind of dying vesper that is a part of all of it and has influenced most of it, yet it doesn't really have the same audience that it ever did before. And a lot of the audience for a lot of this stuff was the same people buying the psych rock, and you can just see that things were about to go in multiple different directions from 67. Rock and roll sounds fairly uniform throughout the 60s. You know, the Beatles come along and kind of change things up, but they're really just kind of adding R&B, and the Stones are adding R&B, black music to white rock and roll, which Elvis was, of course, borrowing from the black tradition as well. And the 60s and drugs and the social movements, it all spoke to a changing of the guard. And music was going to be different from this point forward. And the Doors went that way, the Pink Floyd went this way, Grateful Dead went this way, Mothers of Invention went this way. Soul music stayed very safe and danceable. Jazz goes on the far fringes to the left and the right. It's all so this wide cornucopia that the consumer had this chance to experience and dabble in. And a lot of the social ideas get wrapped up and squelched and driven out by 1970. That movement's gone, and the music becomes very much more mainstream. But all the same, it allowed for what was alternative to exist. And I've often said before, Monk was the first guy to invent alternative. You know, Ellington, of course, gets the nod a little bit, but Monk really starts putting some alternative sounds into music in the late 50s, mid 50s, and starts changing people's ears somewhat. And if you take all the alternative movements that have happened and the fringes of the music that have existed, jazz influenced almost all of it. And the mainstream is always going to kind of stay safe and recoalesce and not allow itself to get too far out there. But 67 was this crazy year where the music industry took the fetters off, and weird sold, wild sold, far out sold. And there's different levels of success, from what the Beatles did to what Hendrix did to what the Doors did to what the Velvet Underground did, the Grateful Dead, to what is happening in jazz music, Coltrane, Shep, Pharoah Saunders. There's all these different levels, and that's great. And it allowed people to really get in where they fit in, as George Clinton once said. So here's hoping that I get to air this without having to edit a lot of this stuff out. I try to keep the snippets short and sweet so there wouldn't be any problems, but you won't know until I go to edit it. So I appreciate y'all for watching. That's 1967 in a nutshell. Soul, rock, and jazz. A lot of things are afoot. And jazz is kind of almost at the end of its run. Soul music is blossoming, and rock is flowering. And so it's an interesting time. And again, there's a cross-germination of the consumer who's buying all this stuff. Probably for the first time. A guy would go in a record store, walk out with a Supremes record, a jazz record, and a Stones record. It's this type of Saunders that I can only dip my toes in so often. For the most part, that screeching, squeaking, it's edgy, it's uncomfortable, it's a place I don't need to be in very often now that I'm 47. Anyway, it was a fun episode to make. Hopefully I can air it. I'll find out here soon. Y'all be safe. Have a great day on the Jazz Shepherd. Peace.